Okay, very good, very good. Okay, this is second part of the session Arctic Communities amid geopolitical and economic uncertainty. My name is Peter Økseth. I work for the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, and I'm going to chair you through this session. The first speaker is Jens Petter Nielsen, Professor Emeritus at UiT, Northern Studies, specialist in Russian history, written many books, published widely on the topic, and today he is going to introduce us to the Norwegian businessman Jonas Lied and his struggle for opening up of the Northern Sea Route to Siberia, 1910-1920. Please, the floor is yours, Jens Petter. Before you begin, sorry, I forgot to take some administrative issues as well. Okay, I will have all the presenters up, they do their presenting, and then afterwards, all the presenters should come up here, and then we can do questions to all the presenters, if that's okay. I think that's okay with the time frame and so on. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, the story of Jonas Lied's Russian adventure in the years 1912 to 17 clearly reminds one of today's situation, when a period of optimism and entrepreneurship in Norwegian-Russian relations was all of a sudden replaced, not only by a setback, but with a complete breakdown, predicted to be lasting for a considerable period of time. In Jonas Lied's case, the breakdown was due to the Russian Revolution of 1917, which was indeed followed by a long period of Russian isolationism. In 1917, the breakdown was caused by the establishment of a regime on the far left in Russia, the Bolsheviks. In 2022, it was caused by a government on the far right, as you know. And still there is a common denominator here, since the Northern Sea Route, to which Lied devoted so much energy, is still on the agenda in Russia today. There is also a growing interest in the history of this topic. And in 2022, we saw the publication of the first comprehensive account of the history of the Northern Sea Route in English, written by an international team of authors under the auspices of the UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. It was published by Brill Publishers under the title From Northeast Passage to Northern Sea Route, A History of the Waterway North of Eurasia. Jonas Lied learned about the Northern Sea Route for the first time on a railway trip between Hamburg and Paris in 1910, when he made the acquaintance of an English gentleman, Alfred Derry, who for some years had been doing business in Russia. He was concerned that merchandise to and from Siberia had to be carried over land at great expenses, and that the riches of this part of Russia were scarcely developed at all. And then there were these gigantic rivers emptying into the Arctic Ocean and paving the way to a possible passage westward to the great centers of European civilization. It seemed a crying shame that such a vast commerce should lie dormant for the want of enterprise. Lied became literally obsessed with this story, and the creation of a viable Northern Sea Route to Siberia became Jonas Lied's great idea, or kongstanke in Norwegian. He was to complete what others had tried before, and in the years that followed, he approached this undertaking very systematically, studying carefully the local conditions of trade with Western Siberia through the Kara Sea. He also paid attention to the legal and political aspects of doing business in Russia. From the start, he cultivated good relations with the Russian authorities to ensure that his enterprise had plenty of political backing. His most important supporter was Grand Prince Alexander Mikhailovich, who as cousin and brother-in-law of Nicholas II had considerable personal influence on the Tsar. One reason for Lied's eventual success may have been that he was careful not to antagonize either the Russian government or Siberian merchants by pressing too hard for duty-free inputs or a free port. And indeed, he did more for the realization of this waterway than anyone before him, except maybe for the Finnish-Swedish polar explorer Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld, who in 1875-76 had carried through the first successful voyages to the estuary of Yenisei, and later the first navigation through the Northeast Passage. In 1912, Leeds Company, the Siberian Steamship Manufacturing and Trading Company, sent its first vessel to Yenisei, but it had to turn back at the entrance to the Kara Sea due to difficult ice conditions. In 1913, Leeds made a new and successful attempt to reach the Yenisei, this time on board a modern cargo steamer. In a shrewd move aimed at attracting publicity, Leeds asked his compatriot Fridtjof Nansen to join him on the voyage. Nansen was important to Leeds' eventual success, but so was Sergei Vostrotin, a Siberian businessman and politician, who also took part in the voyage. Leeds was ready to make most of these possibilities, and the successful voyages were carried through by the Siberian Company for consecutive years. Despite the Great War and the political unrest in Russia, Leeds was very optimistic about the future perspectives of his company. 1916 was a year of great plans, partly because of increased share capital. Leeds understood that the exploitation of the natural riches of Siberia required a tremendous and concerted effort. The Siberian timber industry was poorly developed, and Leeds needed to speed up the timber production in the Yenisei Valley by establishing sawmills. But he also had to develop a river transport capacity before he could start logging operations. In 1914, Leeds had succeeded in obtaining Russian citizenship remarkably quickly, which meant that he could now buy an interest in Russian companies. By 1916, he had a controlling interest in river transport on both the Yenisei and on the river Ob. In spite of its brief existence, Leeds Company achieved quite a remarkable feat in the history of the Northern Sea route. His ships were very well insured. Should they be wrecked or cast into the Arctic, should they strike mines or be torpedoed, they were insured against everything, except against revolution. But that was exactly what happened. In March 1917 came the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, and Leeds had to start all over again, building alliances and finding new protectors under the new liberal democratic regime. 8 months later came the October Revolution, which was the final death knell for his business empire. Although for a long period of time he persisted in imagining that his services were still needed in Russia. For instance, he was more or less convinced that in this difficult moment in Russian history, the Northern Sea route could save the Russian monarchy. In the spring of 1918, this materialized in his plans to rescue Tsar Nicholas II and his family from their captivity in Tobolsk in western Siberia and evacuate them to Britain via the Northern Sea route. But Leeds' plans got only a lukewarm reception in Great Britain by the Tsar's cousin, King George V, and soon the Tsar family was moved by the Bolsheviks from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg, where later that summer they were all executed. So with both the Tsar and white generals gone, Leeds paradoxically put his stake on his ability to convince the Bolsheviks that Marxism must use capitalism for its own ends. And he got his chance with the introduction of Lenin's so-called new economic policy in 1921, when Lenin wanted every communist to learn how to trade and do business. But the Bolsheviks could not really trust a man who had put his stake on the Tsar and the white generals in the Russian Civil War. And he no longer had any patrons in the Kremlin. Lenin was branded as an enemy of communism, which he was, of course, at the bottom of his heart. And since he was now a Soviet citizen, Bolshevik authorities wouldn't let him leave the country either. Lied feared for his life, but managed to escape from Russia in 1931 with the assistance of Norwegian diplomats. His Russian adventure was over. Lied's grand idea was not in itself unviable or implausible. And during the Soviet period, the Northern Sea Route was developed into a crucial artery, a powerful instrument in integrating the far north of Siberia into the Soviet Union and strengthen its grip over these areas. Jonas Lied's stubborn conviction that Russia needed the energy, thoroughness, and efficiency of Westerners to establish the Northern Sea Route was clearly disproved, and it was hard for him to face up to the fact that his services were no longer needed in Russia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jens Petter, for your presentation and for reminding us that the North Sea Route has been on the carpet for a long time and discussed heavily today as well. Okay, the next speaker is Professor Urban Ropeg, the University of Tromsø. He holds a degree, PhD degree in History of Science from Uppsala University, and a Master in Metallurgy and Material Science from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. He has also published extensively in Swedish, English, Norwegian, and Russian on the social construction of knowledge and on regional development in the High North. I think I will stop there. You are going to give us some thoughts on the role of cultural heritage in Arctic societies, undergoing rapid change. The floor is yours, Urban.
Thank you, Peter. As soon as we get the screen going here, thank you. Well, I'm sorry to reappear for some of you who were present in the other earlier session today and maybe got some tired by my voice, but now I'm out of the disciplinary or the arrangers part of this and try to be very quick here with a little bit of ideas and photos on cultural heritage and why it matters, of course, also in the Arctic and how it can be quite complicated. That there are no really quick fixes administratively or research-wise to deal with how cultural heritage is present in a landscape. Even if you try to be kind of, and I understand that from an administrative perspective, it's very difficult to handle, and Europe is full of examples of this, but my examples will be mostly northern then, since we are in an Arctic conference here. So just to remind you, where we have Svalbard, called Spitsbergen before 1920, you can say, roughly, which is an interesting area in the way that, since it was treated as a terra communis before Norwegian sovereignty was exerted over this Arctic archipelago, it has a complex history that is also present in traces on land. These might be small, they are in different conditions, and they are interesting. They are interesting for the tourism, the cruising tourism industry on the islands. I think a bit underestimated. I worked a little bit as a tour guide myself and attended many other trips, and questions about old ruins of huts in different shapes and conditions are emanating, along with, of course, the interesting for nature, for bird watching, for climate change, and what you have around you in this fascinating place. So one way, I think, to remind yourself about how politics went into this and business in a way, is to look at different states of cultural heritage. For example, these buildings that are from, well, Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld, what just mentioned by Jens Petter here. He did an overwintering with the team of scientists in northeastern part of Svalbard. And there were no interest, apparently, in Sweden to keep the house going or to keep it as some kind of heritage or as a rescue hut. So it, with time, it fell into a ruin, which is also a kind of an attraction that draws visitors. You have on the left side or the right side from your correctly speaking here a good example of hunting huts from the 1920s and 30s. This is after Henry Rude, a famous polar bear hunting during the boom time of that. It has been better kept, and it's at a more remote place perhaps. One example of how you try to kind of streamline the management, and this is a matter of debate, is a site after a closed down coal mine in the indicated part of Svalbard, where I visited together with actually archaeologists some 20 years ago. And you can ask why, but this is industrial history, I would say. So it's the history of coal mining, and it poses not only environmental issues, but it also was a highly risky labor situation in coal mines, as we know. So this is how it looked when it was still in operation. And you have these, of course, semi-modern storages of coal, and you have the barracks for people working in the mines, and you have this structure. I would argue just generally that industrial heritage is a bit overlooked sometimes, and that you would say, of course, well, this is something that doesn't represent anything that is not well documented in the literature already. But time flies, and things are dismantled, and built structures in the Arctic might actually sometimes be the only representatives of their kind of a certain technology or a layout of the society. The structure of this building, for example, has been analyzed by other than me. So they shows the kind of Scandinavian model of the ideal little industrial plant where the different categories of laborers and leaders are situated. And you can still find that in Longyearbyen today, which is another of these sites. So, but this example got under the policy that anything younger than 1945 should be not protected as potential cultural heritage. So this sign was decided by the Norwegian parliament to be restored into pristine state, or to turn back to wilderness. And I also would like to invite you to think about this principle and how, what is the rationale behind this. So this is a site after 2023, when this area was cleared of this building, and the mine was, of course, then closed down. And you kind of have this, the idea that a photo is enough of the site, or maybe the map. And yes, there was a serious inventory made of older remains at this site by professional archaeologists. But these are the then Minister of the Environment and the people who worked with the dismantling of this site that posted on this rather curious photo, I think. But we can think different ideas about this. In Longyearbyen, the other site with a longer history of coal mining, we have a richer heritage. This mining history is presented well at the visitor center. And sorry, and draws the attraction for some visitors. I mean, this means a lot to different categories of people, and this is also what you realize if you work as a cruise guide, that people will come to you if you're a guide and want to discuss different things. They are interested in geopolitics, they're interested in marine biology. I mean, the knowledge that the poor guide should have is not possible to encompass in one person, but some are interested in these industrial and economic interests or aspects of the landscape. And of course, in Svalbard, you don't have the indigenous culture present, so there is not these very important aspects of the history there. So these are photos you can see, these remains of the mines that have been left in Longyearbyen, but that are risky places that you really don't, you cannot recommend people to go around these. They are falling apart, they are dangerous, you shouldn't climb them and so on. So there are these aspects about tourism here. But to a little bit sum up on these aspects, it also has to do with how do you make a living in the high north, and we discussed this in part one of this session 7, which is about small business and where you can also establish yourself as an operator, and you can use networks and ideas, what kind of tourists you want to offer that you have gained from other work that you have done. And you come to Longyearbyen and try to start this. And of course, then the discussion about turning back nature to wilderness or getting rid of certain structures is seen as a problem by these operators. I think it's fair to say, but it's an ongoing debate. And you also have to remind yourself a little bit, like the photo here on the far left, that the tourism was actually the earlier than the mining in modern sense on Svalbard. That's a photo from 1925. Then this is when the company from Michigan was mining coal on the side of the Advent on Longyearbyen Valley. But this was only after wealthy industrialists had visited the site arriving by steamship. So tourism is not a latecomer. We have, of course, other examples. My presentation is quite about examples, I think, today, just to open discussion and see the controversies around this. This is a rather well-known Swedish example of the copper and gold mine at Stekenjokk amidst the Sami territory, Sami interested land of meaning and use for Samis. And here it was also interwoven with politics in Sweden at the time, in the labor movement and the Social Democratic Party, and the kind of debate about leaving people without chances to make an industrial-based life in the high north. But this space was leveled to the ground, and it was put up this kind of tablet just to tell about it. I would just, I'm running out of time, say that there are, as we know and as we should know, other ways of doing with industrial heritage that can actually emphasize this. And this is the Eco Museum of Sweden, where I'm just running through. This is an old mining area, and you have many, these are the black spots are actively in the industrial sites today, and the yellow one are the old sites. So you can combine this. And in this instance of an early iron making mill, it turned out it's the one very unusual example where you have the whole structure around this blast furnace at this place. But of course, many of these were burnt down or turned down or rebuilt or covered level to the ground because of other work. So people want to see also this. People that are active in mining or in steel production today. And just to end on the note of controversy that you have, the cross racing of crosses today, or the so how do you, what this mean politically? It's very loaded, and the cross to the left there is also a rebuilt Orthodox cross, not far from Vardø in northeasternmost Norway, and on the right you see the NATO radars pointing to Russia. So there are mixed ideas about is this a proper way of keeping a memory or this particular identity and thinking in a borderland in times of harsh conflict. I don't know the answer, but to be photographed like some did in the group image down on the right there is something that you will be criticized for. So I open the question for you to make up your mind on that, what we ask from the inhabitants of borderlands today. So sorry about the going over the time, but thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rokberg, for your very interesting presentation on cultural heritage. Now I would like to invite a new speaker, Associate Professor Ron Dole, to the stage. Cold War, large-scale experiments impacting global regional environments. That's your topic. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really good to see all of you here today. I want to share two stories with you. Out of the Cold War, we'll see in a moment they're new stories. They're out of newly declassified documents. And there's a surprising, I think, Arctic aspect to what we may not initially think is an Arctic-related story. Some of you may have seen this photograph before. It's not dawn, it's a nuclear explosion seen from Hawaii, early 1960s, atomic bomb in orbit that's exploded. It's a public issue. People know what has happened. What isn't known is what is being discussed at the highest levels of the state. Concerns about the environment, environmental protection, and perhaps occurring at an earlier time than we tend to think was the case. Jerry Wiesner, science advisor to President Kennedy, led a major review. These are some of the documents that have just become available that help us tell this story. They're sometimes a bit hard to read, but they're a treasure trove of new insights. And the key is this item here that was a little bit known publicly: large-scale scientific or technological experiments with possible adverse environmental effects. What could that be? That's all that was known for a time. Please continue. Good folks, I'm seeing the green light come. There we go. Okay. This is a document that has just become available talking about the discussions ongoing in Washington and throughout the country, secret discussions about environmental issues. And there were a number of major themes, possibilities at the time, not only that explosion, nuclear tests in general. There was a project to facilitate communication in the Cold War by putting tiny metallic needles in space that some saw as a form of environmental pollution. And it turns out those were key in the discussions, in part because of scientific intelligence sharing and concerns. But the interesting thing comes out of the discussion. Should this be an issue raised at the United Nations? Wiesner says no. The National Academy of Sciences quietly gets involved. People like Roger Revelle, some of you will know him for the work he did on understanding the role of carbon dioxide in creating temperature rise. makes arguments. This is broadly connected with quite a few environmental issues. People who, like the president of a new university, make arguments about hubris, how people need to have a new sense of responsibility. Again, this is back 1962. One of the heads of the International Geophysical Year. You can see the ways that these people are making arguments. And Morrison, who was one of the key project managers at the Rockefeller Foundation, says this has profound ethical issues. Profound. And he's thinking of science and ethics in a very particular, then discussed context. Again, much of this is done, the discussion, secretly. John F. Kennedy does make an announcement. He gives a major speech just before his assassination, and he calls attention to these concerns and even deliberately mentions the possibility of humans affecting the environment, this 1963. Now, so far, this story hasn't connected into the Arctic. And I think what's interesting, and this is the last story I'm going to be telling here, is there a precedent? These are the developments we've just been seeing back towards the International Geophysical Year, 57, 58. And it turns out there's yet another new set of recently declassified documents that give us a new picture of some of these crucial developments. The U.S. National Security Council meeting at the end of Eisenhower's second term started discussing, let me just briefly, well, that won't matter. They're talking about power positions. Some of you will know that term, power positions, in the sense of what makes one nation stronger or weaker than another. Atomic weapons was a major issue back at the start of the Eisenhower administration. Here's what got considered as a key issue in power positions for the U.S. in 1960. Soviet scientific strength in the physical environmental sciences. There you can see it a little bit more clearly. Knowledge of the physical environment, much better claimed here in the Soviet Union than in the United States, is going to potentially or likely be one of the key factors in determining the relative status of nations. And I've excerpted some of this document here. You can see the assessments and seeing it as domestic, economic, political, national security, strategic issues. And the argument is the U.S. has much more information on the Arctic basin than any other nation on Earth. The U.S. sees the Arctic as military concern, has not made a similar kind of investment. And there you can see those arguments. This is coming on the heels of the IGY, that very large international undertaking to understand the nature, the operation of the planet as a place, as an environment. And I think what's particularly interesting here, who writes these reports? If you think about them solely as internal bureaucratic documents, you may sense they don't have particular significance. Let me end with what is emerging. We are still exploring. These documents are fairly newly released. The report you've seen here is one coming out of the geography division of the CIA. And at that same time, the heads of the American Association of Geographers, you can see that here, were people who had clear and quite strong military national security, and many of you will recognize Paul Seipel in terms of his dedication to research in Arctic issues, Klim and Paul Seipel. In the interest of time, let me simply get to a few key points. One is historian John Oldfield has made clear there was a lot of really significant research going on in the Soviet Union about the larger climate and physical environment at that period of time. Much more can be done about this. I would argue, why does this all matter? What stories do we tell? And how do they inform our sense of policy? Doug Brinkley's recent large book talks about these developments as a kind of, well, developments in the early 60s as proto-environmental. He didn't have access to these documents, to these stories. The public story of environmental concern is different, doesn't include the Arctic, doesn't include this form of pollution. All these developments are occurring long before that late period in the 1960s where we tend to think of the first time that the planet's vulnerability becomes clear. And let me just leave it as what questions come to mind. How do we want to think about policy, contemporary policy? How does history inform better choices? Let me leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Associate Professor Van Dolen of Florida State University, and also a chair of Smithsonian Institute. Oh, this was. Oh, yeah. The next speaker is hopefully joining us digitally. It's Judy Boyd. Judy Boyd, are you with us? Oh, I can introduce her. Judy Boyd is a senior fellow at the Arctic Institute's Senior Information Law Council for the United States Coast Guard and a colonel and judge advocate in the United States Army Reserve. I'll stop there. Judy is going to introduce us to the polycrisis, an emerging framework for homeland security and emergent management applications. Okay, hopefully, Judy, you are with us, and I will leave the screen to you this time. Yeah. Are you muted, Judy? I think we saw you on the screen. Please, Judy, can you wait a second? It's difficult for us to hear you. We see your slides, but we cannot hear you, actually. So please see if there are some technical opportunities for you to look into, or maybe it's in the back here. Is it trouble? Okay. Okay. Maybe we should wait a bit then, Judy, and see if we can, invite you afterwards. Would that be okay? We cannot hear you, you see. I can see you now on the screen, but I cannot hear you here. Okay. Okay, let's have a small. Then we'll try to take you afterwards, Judy, and come back to you. And then we should instead go into the topic of I think it was, we could take Adrian Vlakov, if you're here with us. I don't have any sort of information.
Yes, I am here, and I'm ready to present, if you can hear me.
Yes, that's very good. I can hear you.
Perfect. Just give me a second to share my screen.
I mean, now the sound is working. That's brilliant. Yeah, you're an independent researcher in Bulgaria. That's great. I actually, and you're going to talk about, if I'm not totally wrong, changing landscape. Is that so? Yeah, changing landscape of the Russian Nordic borderland in
Yes,
times of
yes,
uncertainty.
it is
Adaptation or
here. It's on
hybridism.
the screen.
Yeah,
And
the floor,
yes,
screen
I
is
am
yours.
presenting,
10 minutes.
may I have
10
10 minutes,
minutes. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I am presenting here today as a non-affiliated researcher because I think you can guess the reasons for that, and because I'm continuing to study the Russian Nordic borderland from that side, which is close to many scholars doing their careers in the West, and I have been studying this region and this topic for a couple of decades now, and I have been monitoring the progress of events and of what's happening in there during the recent period. And of course, it's kind of an elephant in the room. Something has happened. Something has been happening in the region for during the recent years, and I have been trying to analyze what's going on, what is changing, and how do we refer to that? How do we treat that? Is that adaptation or hibernation? Well, I will try to show that in my slides and in my talk today. So a bit of background. So we know that the Russian Nordic borderland, the Northern Europe, is often referred to as a crossroads of cultures. It's a kind of a trope in social sciences, a place where a lot of movement, a lot of contacts, a lot of cultural exchange has been happening and is still happening for many centuries, and those exchanges have been happening on many levels. And this means, like with some other regions of the world, that this region is of utmost importance to social sciences. And of course, it has been hugely topical during the late 20th century, because after the crisis and the relative lack of contact during the most part of the 20th century, during the Soviet period, the contacts have been reactivated since the late 1980s, since Perestroika, and that's applied to both institutional level, the political exchange, economic contacts and development, and on the grassroots level as well, in the people-to-people cooperation, in everyday contacts of people living in that region. Of course, that included the grand political project like the creation of Barents Euro-Arctic region, which is now in quite a poor state, and the development of those local communities cooperating with each other, contacting each other on daily basis. And of course, that included an attempt of constructing new local identity of this borderland dweller living in that region. And that was working until quite recently. And we all know that several crises have followed during the last decade. That includes the gradual worsening of political climate after Crimea, after 2014, and maybe even earlier. Then the COVID-19 pandemic, which has effectively cut all the contacts in across the border. And then, of course, that what happened well, nearly exactly 3 years ago, the crisis and the war in Ukraine, that has made the greatest rupture in this region. Of course, that disrupted contact on both the institutional level and the grassroots level. Of course, the macroeconomic links have been largely, but not totally, cut, and the grassroots relations have been severely impacted during the physical closure of the border, the lack of opportunity to contact and to cross that border in many on daily basis. And that, of course, the closer the community is located to the border, the more it was impacted and is impacted. Well, this is what I call the most borderland communities. Those are located really close to the border. I mean, some kilometers or tens of kilometers. But of course, that included the geopolitical and more distant contacts as well. And during those years, I have been conducting a lot of anthropological fieldwork in the region, trying to find out what is happening, what's happening, and well, the outcome is that we can observe full collapse in some areas, in some parts of life, and while the other areas develop some kinds of adaptation strategies in this region, and those are really interesting to track. I'm going to show you several pictures of what has been happening there. The southwestern Karelia, the region in Russia bordering southeastern Finland, has been hugely impacted by those crises, because, well, exchange with Finland was vitally important for that. But the region has been turning into a prominent touristic destination, which is very popular within Russia and in other countries. And there is now a touristic boom there, and also the development of local industries such as fishing and aquaculture, such as forestry and all kinds of wood processing, which keep thriving in this region. Although, of course, the main factor for industries were the proximity of Finland, the proximity of border, and the opportunity to export stuff abroad, which has been effectively cut down. Well, a more severe impact in that respect has happened in northern Karelia, in the north of Republic of Karelia within Russia, especially in the town of Kostomuksha, located just on the border, which has been focusing on the iron ore mining and its export across the border, which has been cut during to Western sanctions against Russia after the start of the war. And while the region has lost its prominence as an industrial center, in other areas there is still cooperation. For example, in environmental protection area, like the common ecological projects and so on, which being initiated during the years of friendship still thrive, still continue to work. And also the tourism has been really important for people, and the internal tourism for Russian visitors and for visitors from the so-called friendly countries is still really important. And well, you are going to listen to some of my colleagues presenting on nickel and the Pechenga district, very close to the Norwegian border, which has lost most of its industrial importance because due to some internal decisions by Norilsk Nickel, although it still maintains some limited amount of links to to Norway and maybe to other communities. And while some people still cross the border in Nikel and Kirkenes, quite close to Tromsø, where you are now, and that is still a hope for future cooperation. So I'm just coming to my conclusions. On the institutional level, we can see numerous attempts of economic adaptation, turning inwards inside Russia, developing some Russian industries, or turning towards east. The success of those initiatives depends on geography and types of resources. Was it banned or was it sanctioned or not? Still those substitution activities are always perceived as something temporary, as something that does not work for a long time, and people and businesses are expecting some decision to be made at some point in the future to relieve people of this state of uncertainty that is going there. And of course, even though people realize that the golden age is not something we can come back to, but there are still an opportunities to develop this region industrially. And same happens on the grassroots level. The most important feature here is that living in the borderland is no longer perceived as an advantage. So this is a frequent quotation by people I have been interviewing, that we now live in the middle of nowhere. We don't live in the kind of the center of exchange. The border is not an advantage anymore. Now we are somewhere lives really remotely, and that's what's happening there. And the rupture of people-to-people cooperation and the connection on a daily basis causes the local frustration to grow. And even though people are really inventive and find and invent backdoors in many cases, there is no time to share some details with you. But I've been amazed with this. With how inventive they are. And still we have the same state of uncertainty. The same state of uncertainty as well. So people are not, it's not clear for people how long this might last for. Many people express their desire to continue cooperation after the world, let me quote this, goes back to normal. And even though people are not sure it will, still people continue to hope for that. And my last point here is that maybe my previous studies have produced an outcome that the political projects like Barents Sea Arctic region have not caused an emergence of any shared identity, but the things that have been happening during those crises have united people and maybe started to create a shared local identity in those communities, which might be beneficial for the future. I'd like to finish with this picture shot by myself this early June, when I've been crossing the border between Russia and Norway in Kirkenes. And no matter what, this border is still open. This thing is still open, and the border can be crossed, and I hope that in some time this border will be open a bit more, so that we continue with those contacts, because of course many colleagues today have been talking about the importance of the history of cooperation. I hope this gives us some hope for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrian Blakov, for your very interesting talk. I mean, there's a lot of sorrow actually connected to what you have been talking about. That's for sure. We can talk about that later. Okay, please, Judy, are you with us now? I have not forgot you, Sven Alexander Muttner, of course, but
Great.
We'll take Judy first, since we had sort of a challenger here.
Okay.
Yeah,
And does
please.
it sound better this time?
The screen is
Are you
yours.
hearing me now?
Very good, very good.
Okay, terrific. So I just need to do a quick disclaimer that these are my own opinions that I'm sharing with you today. And what I want to talk about is the concepts and theories related to polycrisis and how it can be a useful analytic framework for public leaders, for crisis managers, for homeland security, emergency response, and anyone else who is involved in analyzing complex crises. The model can be useful because it can help understand the way the crises are built, what hazards or threats are important and urgent, and help develop insights to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from complex systemic crisis. This is the definition of polycrisis that I have put together based on the current research. The importance of this definition to our discussion today from some of the other research that is available is the current research focuses primarily on global polycrisis, but this definition I think is scalable, so you can use it at local, regional, national, international, any kind of crises that has multiple systems at multiple levels interacting together. So the definition and the concept of polycrisis builds upon the elements that are part of a crisis, meaning there's some sort of surprise, there's a sense of urgency, uncertainty, and there may be some potential harms. And as we try and determine what these elements are, polycrisis is building upon research that has been undertaken for several decades in the areas of systems thinking, risk management, and complexity science. And when you take these elements together, what you can do is develop, it looks very straightforward, and it is. And I hope this is, I hope this appears simple, because simple is good, because there's enough complexity once you start applying what appears to be a simple framework. 3 steps are involved, and you just go through them one at a time, but if you follow them sequentially, it should provide insights into the situation that you're analyzing. So the first step is you have to understand the environment. You have to understand the region. You have to understand the village, the dynamics at play. And so there's a mnemonic called PESTLE that is an environmental scanning technique. And PESTLE there's others that you can use, but the key is you want to ask questions to help you understand what are the stressors and what are the triggering events going on in a situation. And each letter of PESTLE stands for a type of system: political, economic, socio-cultural, technological, environmental, and legal. And you see a few examples of the kinds of questions that you can ask to get insight into what is going on in the particular system that you are analyzing. After you identify these stressors or triggering events, you then need to diagram the relationships. So the basic model is what's called a stress trigger crisis model. So you identify the slow processes that are taking place, and then there's often a trigger event that puts the system into crisis. And I'll demonstrate this in a minute. Because we're talking about a polycrisis or a complex crisis, meaning there's multiple systems involved, and there's feedback between the different elements of the different systems, you will need to repeat the diagramming multiple times. And when you do that, what you're able to see is the relationships between not only a single system, but multiple systems, and how they can, again, create feedback loops. So I want to demonstrate how you can do this using a case study of the village of Newtok, Alaska. And Newtok is, it's a coastal community on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region. It's a traditional Yupik Eskimo village with an active subsistence lifestyle. It is reachable only by air or boat. It's been relatively isolated until the mid-60s, which allowed them to preserve a lot of their traditions and customs well into the 20th century. There are approximately 300 residents, with 96% being Alaskan natives. This is a picture pre-Typhoon Merbach, and you can see how much water and the delta region that's around it. What's been going on with Newtok is the villagers moved to this current location in 1949 because they had to create a school by a directive of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And what's happened is the Ninglik River has been eroding at an average rate of 64 feet per year. So if you see the dotted line at the bottom of the picture, that's where they had land. That's where they were actively involved in subsistence lifestyle. And it has continuously eroded just based on the natural waves and storms. And then there were some significant storms that happened throughout the years. What we see is that the permafrost of that area is no longer able to withstand any kind of weight-bearing capacity when it's thawing. And what you see here is just the top part of what used to be a road. And many of the houses that were on land or permafrost are crumbling into the sea. You can see that the constant flooding, they've lost quite a bit of their facilities, lost their river access to the village. It's had other impacts on their landfill, on their water source, their critical infrastructure. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here for the sake of time, but I want to demonstrate using Pestle. What I was able to do is analyze key stresses that have been going on in this village since the 1960s and broken them down by the different factors. And then what I did is first just look at a single system. This is just the environmental system and two critical stresses that have been ongoing, which is permafrost melting and coastal erosion. And then there was a triggering event of flooding that happened in 1996. There were also some significant floods later, but that triggering in 1996 was the first significant loss of habitat. What you can then do is visualize the relationships between multiple systems. I know this starts getting really busy, and this will all be published later this year, and you can look into this in more detail. But what you see is you start seeing the interactions between the systems where the effect of one system is a stressor to another system, or it creates a feedback loop. And it shows how these ongoing stresses and then some fast-moving triggering events can really exacerbate a situation. But what we really can take from this, and this is the value of polycrisis, is that it provides a holistic look at a situation, and it breaks it down so that we can see what parts of the system are most vulnerable and what are the most influential. Because by seeing those, then you can determine, what do we do? Where do we put our money? Where do we put our resources? So just to wrap this up, I think polycrisis, while it's been used somewhat as a buzzword and it's used often with economic and global, I think there's a lot of value at multiple levels and across disciplines to see beyond just your own little area of expertise, but see how there are connections across multiple dimensions. And it can be used to then develop insights that can help determine how to prioritize resources. Thank you.
Complex, but also very interesting sort of case study emphasis. Okay, now we should ask Sven Alexander Muntner to come to the screen, the floor. Shepherd Bush to Svalbard. I mean, you're a special practitioner based in London, focusing on place activation and research.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Shepherd's Bush to Svalbard. Shepherd's Bush is a part in London, for those who don't know, and Svalbard, obviously, we all know about. I want to talk to you about speculative design as a potential path of engagement of the global design community in Arctic communities and futures. And the speculative design concept, I'm not going to go into too much detail, it's quite easy to look up. Roughly, you're looking at those cones, it's really thinking about, or putting the thinking about what kind of futures we can imagine, which ones are probable, plausible, possible, perhaps desired, and put that right into the design process. So before you start putting the pen to the page, you actually think about where are we locating these potential solutions. So it's really about sort of pausing for a moment, a lot of that is connected to empathetic design. So you think about what you're doing to the environment that you're designing into. I'm Sven Müntner. I'm from the University of the Arts London in central St. Martin. So it is a creative university. It's design-based. It's not natural sciences-based. So that's really why I'm here. And the talk will be about setting up the Arctic unit in London, very much purposefully so, where we're not from the Arctic. The reason for that was really about developing a community of practice and a knowledge base in London around the conditions and the sensitivities you need to have. The purpose is also to learn from communities, so thanks Urban for that introduction to Svalbard, really trying to understand that nature and perhaps offering a few solutions and tools that one could use in other disciplines that are coming from the design community. So there was a good thing about Christine Dupro earlier about human-centered design, so that's really picking up that thread. It's slightly different, but related. And then if you then think about problems that might make sense in more practical terms, it's about thinking about mental health infrastructure. What would that look like in spatial terms? How would an architect, urban designer build that into Svalbard, right, for the next 50 years? What does it look like? How can we build civic infrastructure that's resilient in the context of grey zone activity? And that's just on the rise. Or perhaps, and thanks again for Ronald for picking up that large-scale experiment theme, and I fear we're on the cusp of perhaps making some large-scale experiments in the next few years, or that's happening. So how can we perhaps change that thinking? And so I'm just going to do a quick deep dive. It's going to be quick, and if you have questions, welcome. Just where it's coming from, so I've been having a long-standing research interest in Hammerfest, so that sort of was one of the root causes important to state there as well. Obviously, the teaching within London and the lens at Central St. Martin's is planetary care and decolonialism. And then the inquiry was really about the design thinking and how it could contribute to the discourse. So it started with something quite practical and perhaps counterintuitive, not very scientific, but important, is that situatedness. So to understand that, it is very abstract for audiences that don't have that special knowledge, was that we did a screen printing workshop where we got some Copernicus data and we actually screen printed the extent of the sea ice on that very day with a few days delay to really actually to understand, okay, so how does that map out? Where does it start? What could it mean? So out of that, we then created that positionality of that course, of that unit, where we sort of were exploring responsibilities and limits of that of the global Arctic within the London context. The purpose was really to sort of develop sort of a community of practice around the communities in the Arctic and their futures, and then develop a toolkit for designers to really respond to that uncertainty which is prevalent in the current Single Polar North. So to make it quick, there we go. It's basically a mixture, it's a hybrid unit between architecture and urban design within Central St. Martin's. So it's not rocket science, it's basically located in the spatial practices department. But also there's other connections, and that's Morgan's here, that's very kind, so we were reaching out and collaborating. The Scott Puller Research Institute, which is around the corner, Institute of Global Health, Helix Center, and then within the university, obviously, there's elements like biodesign, service design, and really it's about borrowing and collaborating from it. Now, didactically, we all know it's always important to create a canvas when it's an abstract topic. Now, this was a steal. I mean, I don't know whether you're aware of it. One of the lesser-known Jules Verne novels, and one of those future-gazing excellences. So, just to sum up the plot, the reason why it's here is it's a sort of the sale of the North Pole, I think, beyond the 84th. It was published in 1890, yes. And it was basically purchased by a secretive American syndicate, the North Pole, with the view to build a massive cannon in the Himalayan, fire that off, tilt the Earth, ice melts in the North Pole, and they can start extracting. So it's a return of investment. So it's a silly story, but obviously what was quite interesting when you look at it in terms of building that empathy for a place. It was quite interesting when we looked at that. And actually, I learned yesterday that shipping companies apparently have no financial incentive to go via the North Pole, but it's in the public discourse. So this is from New York Times, the sea route via the North Pole. We had the sale of a large chunk of Svalbard being advertised last year, and then deep sea mining that sort of popped up as a discourse last year. And obviously, we don't need to talk about much that, but it's basically piling up, and it was really about being aware of what the community in London absorbs, and then use that as the canvas to query and, like, obviously debunk it. So just to look at how that then could play out, we had that speculative design. Again, I encourage you to look at it. It's very applicable to other disciplines as a propositional strategy. So when we think about, okay, what are we going to do when we look at Svalbard? What can we do with the next 50 years? This is quite nice to sort of map this out. And it's quite a nice exercise for things you may already have in the pipeline or that you're building up. We talked about, like, that kind of situatedness, which is really important, and we're quite aware of in terms of what we as a non-Arctic community have to bear in mind and the sensitivities around that. We used a lot of GIS as a vector to connect to a lot of the scientific discourses, because the sort of the sharing of that knowledge and data obviously is extremely positive, and the flow is very good, and starting from the sea ice extent all the way to mining data, and that connects obviously to your theme, urban. And then we used something which we call the entanglement journal, which is really a reflection on how you connect to your to the Arctic. This is just a quick sum up of people that we connected to in that area expertise, methodological expertise, and thematic. That ranges from defense to the various methodologies, and Alex helped us very much from the Global Health Institute to think about, like, how we can apply the speculative design in that. And again, we can go into that. I just want to give you a quick example of how it could play out. So this was one of the people who joined that cluster, and it was about thinking about how perhaps non-human, modern human rights could be applied to Svalbard, the archipelago, and how one could sort of create an environment that can sort of flip, by small manipulations of the existing conditions, create a situation that allows design over a long period of time. So she started with archival research in the Scott Polar Research Institute, not so much about, like, the perspective, but just more getting sort of into the finer grain of people drawing, people taking pictures of the morphology. For a London member of the design community, that's a very valid, helpful tool to do so. Then in terms of that, looking at the code that we saw, was a very helpful way of using the sort of speculative design by creating several comic strips to play out scenarios of how it could play out, where you have sort of alternative futures with design interventions and how they could then play out for particular communities. That then resulted in a proposition which was quite interesting. It was not spatial for a designer. She then intervened in the Svalbard Treaty and was testing with legal experts how could we manipulate that speculatively to change wordings, to then change the framework and go and into a path of towards more than human rights. And then basically it had a spatial form which was towards the design center that brings international scientists together, who then built the case for attributing the more than human rights to the archipelago. So quite unlikely, she, rather than starting with a pen, drawing something that is like a port or a school or something like that, it took a really interesting turn and became basically legal in proposition. So I'm not going to do the next example, but it basically was based around the comments. But I just want to say that we're sort of, this is the start of a 5-year pilot. The takeaway is pretty clear. It wasn't used in spatial design that much at all, so, and I can encourage you to adopt it as well. Helps to instill confidence in really difficult, uncertain design contexts. And I think the important thing is that it really helps develop an empathetic design perspective. And we're collaborating, so the next chapters are mental health and well-being, and grazer on infrastructure and how they relate to communities, and whether we could do something similar. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Sven Alexander, for a very interesting presentation, methodological issues. Do we have Alexei Ryzhkov and Anna Alagina with us digitally? They are actually they're independent researchers. They're going to introduce us to fragile societies in the north, and especially the border town Nikel. They are great. Global turmoil. Okay, thank you. Good to see you. The screen.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you. The screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here. I'm glad to be in Tromsø, even digitally. Today we are going to talk about one cross-border town in northwest Russia. Its name is Nikel, and it's been an industrial settlement throughout decades. Since 1990s, it can be classified as a company town, hugely dependent on one big federal extraction corporation. But in 2020, the smelter shop, the main enterprise in the town, was shut down. On the other hand, it's a borderland community, and its population has been, or used to be, depends on the point of view, used to be engaged in a number of cross-border practices with Norwegian neighbors. And also, it used to be a vital place for bigger frameworks of cross-border transnational cooperation. Maybe the most famous example is Barents Region project. Although, because of several crises of 2010s and 2020s, the most notably the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine, cross-border cooperation has been halted.
Okay. In our research, we use data from 3 anthropological trips to Pekinga districts. In each of them, we stayed and worked in Nikel. We collected our data through observations, semi-structured interview, linguistic landscaping. Also, we analyzed relevant websites and social networks. We have wondered how the Nikel community imagines its future while going through a severe crisis.
Town's employment structure, infrastructure, as well as identity strategies are closely connected to industrial production. Therefore, the smelting shop shutdown is often seen as a kind of herald of local social apocalypse. People compare the fate of Nikel to that of other deindustrialized settlements in the region. Rumors about why it happened, the shutdown, link Nikel to broader, wider socio-economic and political processes, including cross-border and transnational ones.
The corporation and regional Murmansk authorities promote tourism in Nikel as a driver for post-industrial transition. They believe the recent industrial past, its infrastructure, for example, Kawa, Kotsilvara, an active mine, to be main attraction. Townspeople tend to highlight the natural sites around the Nikel and in Pacific Natural Reserve, which has its own tourist infrastructure. Besides, some mention historical tourism, mostly related to the Second World War. There used to be more active cross-border tourism before the 2020s, but now it's virtually non-existent. However, the local community hardly sees sustainable future based on tourism. There are several reasons for that, including the town's relative remoteness, the stricter border control regime, and the lack of necessary infrastructure. These factors also prevent Nikel from functioning as a tourist hub in the district. One more scenario is connected to the ongoing militarization in the Russian-Norwegian-Finnish borderland. Nikel, as some believe, might turn into a military settlement similar to a number of ours in Pekinga district. Many in Nikel are not enthusiastic about this transformation since such towns are associated with cultural isolation and social stagnation.
There are a number of other diverse scenarios. Some of them have a kind of utopian tones. Some of them, at the same time, kind of based on perceived experience of Norwegian neighbors in post-industrial transition, especially one that people believe happened in Kirkenes, seeing a kind of tiny welfare town as a possible but kind of really impossible future for nickel. There are also some minor hopes for new industries, that some people would come and maybe use the abandoned industrial infrastructure. It kind of reflects the old-fashioned modernist ideologies in the place. Most of those narratives, however, end in a kind of eschatological tone, because people, most of townspeople, don't see the bright perspectives for the town. They believe it actually will turn into a ghost town at some point of time.
Yeah, we think that these diverse scenarios of the future clearly demonstrate the lack of unified strategy for maintaining the life of the town. The decisions of the corporate and state actors from the center to develop tourism and settle the military in the border town of Nickel are unlikely to work, according to the opinions of residents.
Post-industrial transformation in Norwegian borderland, or at least images of it, so perceived experience of Nordic neighbors, is not seen as something likely to be repeated in Nikel and in Pechenga district in general. Cross-border interaction is no longer seen as a reliable resource for the development of the territory, not only because of several crises, well, including military ones, but also because people feel that the cross-border legacy didn't actually leave anything to rely on, anything really sustainable. Narratives, the only feature that is really common in different narratives is their eschatological tone. So the idea of local social apocalypse happening here. To end the story, or at least to stop it on a brighter note, we used this picture. This is one of the oldest buildings in Nickel. It was created by Finnish builders when this place was named Kolosjoki, and it belonged to the Finnish state. But now you can see this building is being renovated and reimagined, and in the mural there is an image of a very famous Russian Soviet rock artist Viktor Tsoi, and words of one of his songs that go something like this: if there is step, there must be footprint. If there is darkness, there must be light. Which is, I think, for the Arctic region, especially in times of our crisis, is really relevant. Thank you very much for your attention.
Anna, for your presentation. Nickel for sure represented sort of a continent in this post-Cold War collaboration with Norway and Nordic countries in the north. So very interesting to listen to your viewpoints of the present situation now. Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions. I would like to have all the presenters here on stage, if that's okay, even though it's only 10 minutes. All the presenters on stage. And please, if you have questions, well, you can raise them. And we'll have a small debate here in the end. Okay. We have one question down there. Oh.
Thank you. You had mentioned, I forget your name, sorry.
Sven.
Sven? Yeah. You had mentioned gray zone in your talk, I believe. And I'm actually right now finishing a second article on hybrid war, Russia and the West. I started out on Svalbard, actually. And I'm wondering how you look at it, what you're doing, how you see it unfolding, and the extent to which there is awarenesses and policy that connects to it that is both state-based and collaborative. Thank you.
So I'm not an expert on the policy on this one. I think it is always quite important to remember that as a designer you need to than if you enter a particular arena that you design for, that you get the right expertise to that. So in that instance, we had Thomas Newdeck, who is a journalist in defense, and particularly around call for infrastructure and how that translates into the current situation. So we were looking at severing cables, right? So it's all over the news now, but quite interesting. I think 4 to 6 weeks before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, there was a cable severed, I believe, between Sweden and the northern mainland. So it wasn't really in the news. So it was already something that sort of created uncertainty and fear. So I think that. So if you think, you then boil it down, we may not have the answer to specific defense infrastructure. I think this is for other people to solve. But what does that mean for a community? What does it mean for social cohesion? What does it mean for civic infrastructure? How can you develop a city that feels safe to live in within those conditions? You know, and I think it could be a simple answer and that really depends on talking to members of the community. It's about infrastructure that gives you the feeling of social cohesion. So it could be a swimming pool, public swimming pool, right? Or the provision of a crash, or if that is what is currently missing and sort of creating tension within the community, or as we've heard, the out-migration, what can we make for this community to make people feel safe? So I think it's around that, and again, that's really the perspective of empathetic design. And I don't think it's a direct solution on how can we deter a ship from severing a cable. Does that make sense? And I think if you then would project that back into policy, it would be how can we underpin that provision so we have sufficient civic infrastructure that gives us a sense of security, safety and cohesion. That would be my answer.
We have one more question here in front. May I use it, Spati, please? Thank you.
Hello. Yes, I'm Laura Junkalkio from University of Lapland. I want to thank everybody, but especially our non-affiliated scholars who are joining us here. And I actually have, and if I may ask you to kindly move a little bit, I have a question for the last presenters, because you are in front of the projection. Yes. So, so thanks. So it was very interesting, and I am, of course, I have a self-interest in my question. I'm researching the impact of the social and cultural and so forth impact of militarization in northern Finland and Sápmi. And I would just fix attention that you mentioned that the fact that there were military installations around the town or whatever you call it was considered, did I get it right, that it was considered a problem from the perspective of tourism? Or if you would like to elaborate a little bit on that, what was the view of those being there and their impact on the development and future visions?
Thank you very much. It's a great question. So militarization today especially in that region of Russia, kind of Russian Nordic, in the broader region of Russian Nordic borderland, is very often about the increase of number of military personnel there and reopening, reusing abandoned Soviet infrastructure. That's one of really important issues here. And for some semi-abandoned settlements, non-military settlements, or settlements that in whose future we see this kind of shrinking, militarization might be seen by some actors as a kind of revitalization drive. But local people here in Nikel, and actually in some other places, non-military places in Pechenga district, don't see this as a vital thing, because and the main issue here is that they don't believe that military settlement is something that can be kind of organically integrated into social tissue of the region. Yeah, so it's something they see already exist in military settlements there, and there are a number of them in Murmansk region and in Pechenga district especially, as something really different worlds, so worlds apart. We have our Nikel, and there are military settlements around, and people living there, they're not really kind of not connected enough. And therefore, this militarization is not seen as a strategy to revitalize life here. Yeah, so they don't see it as something natural to them.
Okay, one more question, because now we're running out of time. I was in the back here, wasn't it? Please, there. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Gro Holm. I'm from the Norwegian Broadcasting, former correspondent in Moscow. And I have a question for Mr. Vlachov, maybe also for the two others of you from Russia. One thing is how military structures influence and not influence, but both in Karelia and in Peshmerga there has been quite a heavy pressure for people to join the war or the special operation, as they call it, in Ukraine. And both regular formations have gone there, we know, and also contract soldiers. So how do this sort of influence the thinking about contacts to the West? We know that there are some restrictions publicizing when people come back dead in local press, etc. But how does it influence the thinking about being an open society and being in contact with Norway and other Nordic countries?
Thank you for your question, and I will take it from the researcher perspective. I would say that the things that you've mentioned are true for the entire territory of Russia, so Northern Karelia and Murmansk Oblast. All this Russian Nordic borderland is no different from other places, and I have been conducting fieldwork in other parts of the Russian Arctic recently. So this is widespread even in Moscow, even St. Petersburg, in any other parts of Russia. So people are joining the war effort, the military structure. So this is not something specific, but what is so special about this region, so the Russian Nordic borderland and the Russian Northwest, due to its prolonged contact with the West, with Northern Europe, with the Europe in general, and I mean the attitude of people towards it, and well, this experience of being in contact, of being transparent, of being able to provide some critique for some societal processes, for some political issues, and so on and so on. Of course, this heritage of cooperation with the West, it provides some results, more stark contrast with what has been going on in other places, and I think this is one feature of this region. So basically, when you have this history of contacts, you generally inherit something from what has been happening. This is why the societal impact and political response from local communities in the Russian Northwest have been so open and so vocal for those processes, and they continue to be so. You can find a lot of examples that in media. So I think this is the answer.
If I may have a very small kind of methodological and ethical addition. We are field workers, and we talk to people, and these issues today are extremely, actually those topics, some opinions on them are criminalized in Russia. So it's both, so we try to be careful both for the safety of our informants and for the safety of us researchers. That's why to answer such questions, we have to use certain indirect data, some hints, some background information. And so you have to keep it in mind when you talk about the common opinions, about common narratives and frameworks related to the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you a lot. Thank you for the speakers of this session, reminding us of the complex situation we are in, globally, also locally. And thank you for all of you attending and for all the very good questions. So leave it with that.